Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast. As always, I am joined by my co-creator and best friend, Barry Taylor, and we are very pleased and privileged and honored to have a very special guest with us today, Jo Luehmann. Hi, Jo. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you have been a very busy person on social media lately. And your Instagram account has blown up in the last, what would you say, like 5 or 6 months, longer than that?
Yeah, something like that. Like probably in the last 8 months, it
Yeah, several months.
grew faster than, it was growing really slowly, which I was totally fine with.
Yeah,
But then in the last 8 months, it started growing a lot faster.
yeah. Can you, before we jump in and really kind of get going on the conversation, can you just talk a little bit about who you are and the work you're currently doing?
Yes. My name is Jo Luehmann, like you said, and then I was born and raised in Colombia, and I moved to the US to do an internship at a church, and then to do a master's program in a evangelical. Yeah, Point Loma is an evangelical church. It's a Nazarene church, a Nazarene university. Sorry, and I started working inside of different churches. I worked at two churches officially, and then a third church I volunteered a lot of time, and just evangelical churches, doing a lot of work and doing whatever they asked me to do, with a lot of training too. So just I got really uncomfortable inside of the church. Like, the reason I wanted to work in churches was because I wanted the world to be better, which is still what I want. Like, that part hasn't changed. I wanted the world to be better, and I thought that the avenue was the church. But the deeper I got into working in the church and doing things inside the church and studying theology, the more I realized this isn't really helping anybody. Like, the world isn't better. In fact, it kind of looks like we're making the world a lot worse.
Yeah.
So that realization in my 30s, with three children and a husband and a whole entire life that was built around the church, was really scary, and it was devastating. And so I started doing the work of, like, what does it look like then to make the world better? What does it look like? Like, I still have that goal, I still want to do that. What does it look like? What does it mean? And can I do that? And does it even matter? Like, can we? I gave myself permission to ask all the questions, like, can we even make the world better? Does it matter? Is there anything that matters anymore? So that's what I do now. I kind of talk about how can we make the world better. And I still talk a lot about theology and a lot about spirituality, but I talk more about systems of oppression and, being free to be able
Yeah.
to be the people that we were supposed to be, without all the indoctrination and all the constraints of society. So yeah, that's what I do now.
Yeah. Thank you for that introduction. So I can't remember how I came across your Instagram. I think I've been on it for a couple months now. I don't know if someone reposted something in their story and I found you that way, but you have been prolific the last, well, I've probably only been following you for a few months, but I think your Instagram has really started to take a turn in terms of its popularity the last several months. But you just don't shy away from getting right to the crux of some of the most complex issues of faith and Christianity. You talk a lot about superiority complexes and the damaging nature of purity cults. You go after white supremacy, and you go after white privilege and colonization within Christianity in the West. Like, you really don't mince your words, and probably as many fans as you probably have a similar amount of enemies, I suppose. I know that you kind of post these really weird and gross comments that you get often, kind of, to say, don't think like this, don't do this. But in terms of your Instagram growth and just how fast your platform, I say Instagram because that's where I follow you, but I know you do Clubhouse and TikTok and all of those things. What nerve do you think that you're hitting here with people, that people are just loving what you're putting out? I mean, I know
Oh,
why
they
I love it.
love
What
it.
do you think? Yeah, what do you think is
Yeah.
the you're hitting?
You know what I get the most, like the feedback that I get the most, is that I help them put words to things that they've been thinking, but they couldn't, like, pinpoint. So yeah, that I hear that a lot. And I think one of the things that helps me is, like, I have a lot of theological training. So I didn't start my account immediately after I left the church. In fact, I disappeared from the world, first because I was told to do that. I was told, like, disappear, you cannot talk to anybody, which was, like, now looking back, I'm like, this is ridiculous. But the good thing about that is that I had some time to just be quiet and kind of, it caused also for me to be very lonely and sad, and I was very depressed, and but it also allowed for me to just sit with me and deal with me and with my own trauma. And so I didn't start the account, and I didn't start the account to grow an account or to start anything. I just was studying a lot and learning a lot, and I was starting to see all of the connections between the Christianity that I had been given and white supremacy and systems of oppression. And I wanted to share the things that I was finding. And I thought, well, maybe some people will find this helpful. You know, I was hoping that I wasn't going absolutely, and I say these, and sometimes people think that I am using this hyperbolically, but I really thought I was going crazy. I'm like, am I going crazy making these connections? Am I going crazy thinking that this is terribly abusive? And so I was learning about trauma and learning about abuse and learning about different, like the neuroscience behind what happens with us when, you know, when we are traumatized and when we're scared all the time, and when we have this relationship with divinity that tells us that we are bad. And I wanted to share that because I really thought, you know, I'm either going crazy, or I'll find a few other people that are like, no, yes, you are not, like, this happened to me too. And I think that my theological training and the fact that I am a person of color talking about, you know, the white supremacy of the world, of the Christian world, because I hadn't found anybody talking about that connection. You know, I found a lot of people talking about, not a lot, but some people talking about, like, this is abusive and this is wrong and this is not okay. But I couldn't find anybody talking about the oppression, like the white supremacy. And I think that because the deconstruction, what people call deconstruction, which is people just asking questions of their faith, and, you know, it's a very white space. There is a lot of white people in it. I think that they maybe had never noticed that there was a lot of white supremacy, a lot of racism, a lot of, like, colonization is completely just white supremacy and racism. And maybe just because they hadn't felt it, but my experience inside of the white evangelical church was rife with microaggressions, rife with, I don't even know why they call it microaggressions. They are just full on aggressions.
Yeah,
And
they're
it's
macro.
violent. Yeah, like it's violent, you know, talking about how I had to pray to break any, like, relationship that I had with my indigenous ancestors because that was demonic. And, like, those things are just aggressive and violent, and they divorce you from you. So I think that maybe because people hadn't felt it, and being able to feel it, I was like, I have to talk about this because it was my experience, and the church is never going to do better until they address the systems of oppression underneath it. And so, you know, I think the church is never going to do better, period. But if they were to, they would have to address the systems of oppression. So I think that between the fact that I can give some language and the connections I was making with systems of oppression, I think that it just kind of resonates with people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, what usually when we hear about postcolonial theology or liberation theology, it's happening in a sect of, you know, the academy when it comes to seminary and theological thought, you know, Black theology, feminist theology, liberation theology. It's all just ways of doing theology, as opposed to, no, this is the meta narrative of Christianity to be set free and to be released from oppression and not, you know, succumb to systems of colonization and oppression. But I thought it was really interesting. You said that the deconstruction world has predominantly been white, and you would probably add male dominated to that as well.
I would not, no.
You
a
wouldn't.
lot of women.
Yeah.
A lot of women. It's just white, but a lot of women are a part of it. Yeah.
I mean, I would agree. I guess the last, I don't know, maybe couple of years, the deconstruction conversation, Barry and I have been talking about this the last couple months, really. The deconstruction conversation has really overflowed at a pop culture level. It's becoming more popular than ever. More people are becoming engaged with it and, you know, conversing with it more than ever. So yeah, I guess I'm still trying to figure out who's in it and kind of who's, you know, the loudest voices. And I guess I'm just seeing a lot of men at the top. But with that being said, I know that when I first found you on Instagram, I saw that your bio said deconstructing and decolonizing, I think.
Yeah.
But you've recently changed that to just decolonizing. So tell us about the dropping, the deconstruction. I'm very interested in that.
I love that you noticed.
I had to
Yeah,
prepare for the conversation. So when I popped back on your Instagram, I'm like, oh, she dropped that. I need to ask her about it.
I did. I changed it, and I put decolonizing and dismantling.
Mm.
I'm pretty sure. I want to make sure now that I did add the dismantling part, but this is the thing. Deconstruction has become such like everything gets co-opted. Yeah,
Yeah.
decolonizing and dismantling. Everything gets co-opted, by the mainstream. Everything gets co-opted by systems of oppression, really. So when you're talking about any movement that has become something that starts transforming people's lives, or something that starts giving people freedom and liberation, really, it always gets co-opted. And I saw that that's happening with deconstruction already. It's gotten co-opted, and I mean, it hasn't been bad yet, but it's going to. And so we have white evangelical Christians, super conservative, writing books on deconstruction and how deconstruction has to look a certain way. And and deconstruction as it was already incredibly white space for me. Like I always, people, especially white atheist men, always tell me, like, you never make space for the atheists. I'm like, that's not true. And if anything, I think there is no space for us, the people of color. Like in any of these conversations, where are the people of color? Because we have to carve our own spaces. And then it's like, oh, she talks about the people of color. It's like, no, I talk about systems of oppression, which affects all of us. Like, it's not just about the people of color. And even when you were talking about how, it's theology, and then there is feminist theology, and then there is liberation theology, and then there is womanist theology. It's like the norm is the ones that have the most power. Those are the norm. And then the rest of us are kind of just behind, doing our own thing, instead of normalizing us. Like, all of us are speaking from all of our experiences, and there is no one norm. So I was like, I don't care about deconstruction anymore, though that's still a lot of the work that I do. Like I make all of these I try to make them easy to digest, but meaty enough kind of highlights where I explain certain topics, and I just kind of deconstruct them slowly. So the last one I did is on the number 666, and deconstructing them and going slowly, like, this is where it comes from, this is what it meant in context, and adding a lot of nuance. And I don't tell people what to believe at the end. I just say, you can believe whatever you want, we all can, but this is the history of it, this is what we have behind it. So that's deconstructing work. But behind all of it, the work that I want to do is the decolonizing and dismantling of systems of oppression. Like, that is my focus, that's what I care about. And if we just, like, I realized if deconstruction were my work, I wouldn't be doing anything important, because it is important. Let me rephrase that. It is important, however, it's incomplete. Because you can deconstruct all of your theology completely and continue to be abusive and continue to harm people. Because what we need to do is to dismantle systems of oppression and decolonize systems, like decolonize our thinking, decolonize the way that we see the world. And that is true for all of us, regardless of identity. So I dropped it because I'm like, I don't want to be associated with the deconstruction. I mean, I will still be, because that's part of my job. But my main focus, I wanted to be decolonizing and dismantling. So yeah, that's why I dropped it. Also, I was receiving a lot of feedback from white evangelicals, and being like, help me understand deconstruction. I'm like, that's not my job. That's not. But they don't ask about decolonizing and dismantling because they don't understand what I'm talking about.
It's like not even in their heads that somehow this version of Christianity, this 21st century white Western American version, isn't the the original or the genesis of it, or what it's meant to be.
No, they think it's just. Go ahead, Barry.
I was just going to say, the funny thing to me is that I actually think what most people in that deconstruction world are doing actually isn't deconstruction anyway. It's an attempt to dismantle, but at a surface level and not at a lower, more getting down to actually what's the real issue. I mean, we've had this conversation quite a lot, that because philosophical deconstruction is something entirely different than what's going on in that circle. And that's just a name, and it works, but as you said, it's also very, it's on that kind of fringe world where it's about to be commodified into non-existence, much like the emerging church of a decade or so ago. It's the same dynamic, I think. And but I think dismantling is a much more actually pertinent idea for the process of what's actually people are trying to do. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I was writing something yesterday about how because we have created a society where the comfort and needs of only a few are the most important.
Sure.
When we don't address that, and when we don't address the root causes, which we don't all the time, like, we talk about all of these things and we're like, oh, this is what we're going to do. We're going to create these laws that that will reduce risk, but we will never address the root cause. And the risk reduction is useless. It means that we are starting at the idea that the harm is unavoidable, and that's not true. The harm is not unavoidable inside of the church. The harm is not unavoidable inside of society. What we need to do is address the root causes and address the root perpetrators, but we're not willing to do that because they have too much power. So, and that's what happened inside of the church. They want to talk about all of these things, but they want to continue to keep and hold on to the root causes. It's like, well,
they want to control the narrative.
Right. So I'm like, good luck with that. We'll see you in 20 years again.
Yeah. Because every generation has their version of deconstructing. It may be called different and it may look different, and then it gets co-opted, and then it loses steam, and then it shows up in the next generation. It's really interesting. What do you think it's going to take to see the type of reform that you're working towards? And do you think that's even possible? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, you're involved in some kind of faith community project? You're still a pastor?
That's my job, officially speaking. I'm a reluctant pastor, but I don't have a congregation, or I'm not part of an organized church officially. My husband and I have a nonprofit, but we don't have a congregation. The reason we have the nonprofit is because we were getting together with some friends and having dinner, and we didn't know what to do with our tithes, and we were having all these conversations about faith and about all of these things over dinner. And then we decided to start putting our money together and started like some projects here in San Diego and in Tijuana, because we were like, well, we were tithing, and we still, and there is no compulsion, nobody has to do it or anything like that, but we work with some like different projects in Tijuana that are actually beautiful and great, and address the root causes of issues. And so that's why we have the nonprofit, which has served us. It has been great to be able to do certain things, but I don't have we don't have a congregation. I'm not hired, like I don't get paid. Nobody gets paid. We just had dinner before COVID. We don't have dinner anymore.
Yeah. Right. I bet. So yeah, do you think the kind of change that you're working towards is possible? I mean, you probably do, and you have to believe that it's possible on some level, otherwise it would be hopeless and you wouldn't be doing it. But what do you think it's really gonna take to see the kind of change and transformation you're working towards and for?
A lot of healing. A lot of healing, which I see happening. I especially I see happening with parents, and I see happening with younger people. So this is a slow work. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's going to be, it's a lot of work that is going to be decades in the making. But I see healing happening, especially coming from marginalized identities. A lot of healing happening. I don't know if you both saw the Little Nas X video.
Yeah.
But just that video, the fact that video is out, the fact that it got the amount of positive feedback, the fact that people were watching it, that alone that would have never happened 20 years ago. He's sending a very clear message. It's not just a theological message, it's a political message. I will not be silent anymore. You will not continue to demand that we repress ourselves for your comfort. So even that, it's a huge, it's a huge statement, and you see a lot of change, and you are seeing a lot of different marginalized identities saying, you know what, we're done. We're done being oppressed. We're done being told you cannot. So we're seeing progress, but I think that there is the component of healing. It could probably, we could be more intentional about that. And I think a lot of people are being intentional, but I was reading, that's what I want to talk about today. I have topics in my head, but what I wanted to talk about today on social media was child abuse and how it is normalized. I was reading some, you would think they are on the more progressive side of Christianity, some of them, And they were talking about how parents need to start really like disciplining their children better, disciplining them more, and kind of not allowing for them to do a lot of things, which is really taking away their agency. And how because we don't address the root causes of issues, they've stopped beating them, but now they just take agency away, as though psychological abuse is less harmful than physical abuse. Some people argue that it's the opposite. I'd rather you beat me than, psychologically abuse me. So I think that if we continue to deal with, hey, what are the root causes? And if we continue to give children language, and the accessibility to information today, I think it's changing everything too. People are able to access information. The reason I learned about trauma was not because I found a book about trauma. It was because I started following some accounts that were talking about trauma. And I was like, wait, what is this thing that you're talking about? And then they said about the books, I found the books and I read the books. But being able to have this accessibility to information, to have, it's both a curse and a blessing, but people being able to hear so much about their own experience, to be able to see themselves in others and say, oh, it is not normal for parents to beat their children. Like, this is what happens. And I was beaten. So what did it do to me? So I think that if we continue to focus intentionally on healing, what does it look like to heal? And for me, to address my own trauma and to address my upbringing and what it did to me, and the whatever it is that I internalized about myself. So we'll continue to move toward a healthier society. And parenting alone has changed so much in the last 50 years, 20 years. I realized that in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, they started talking about parenting as there were experts on parenting. These just started at the end of the 19th century. In the 20th century, then that boomed and exploded. And all of these experts were men who were working all the time, not really raising their children. And they were mostly doctors. And they were just giving their opinion. And then it's not until the last 50 years that we started having people talking about that with more of no, we're actually looking at families. And the interesting thing is that at the beginning, they were looking at families that were white and middle class, and which is a completely different dynamic than, the way I was raised, or the way Black people are raised. But now we are having the conversations where it's more like, no, it's different, and we need to talk about the differences. So we're getting more and more specific about all of these things, because I think that between parenting and education, we really could make a difference in society. We really could.
Yeah, and we could potentially have a generation coming to the fore without all of this baggage and trauma from religious upbringings, whether it's evangelical or Catholic or Protestant or whatever, because every denomination, every vein of Christianity has their own baggage and their own trauma. Of course, we would probably raise evangelicalism up to the top of, what's wrong and what's happening there. But you said so much that I would love to unpack. Specifically, let's go back and just talk about the Little Nas X. Let's talk about that video just for a second, because you brought it up, and I know you've spoken out about the Grammy performance of Cardi B, and I mean, these are they're artistic expressions. They're people of color, women of color, expressing themselves as an artist through their work, through culture, and I always find it so fascinating when people get so up in arms about what is being presented in a video or a stage performance. It's a narrative, a story is being told, and a particular role is being taken on at that moment. And so, just can you say a little bit more about what you think of some of the, I guess, conservative religious outcry against these kinds of displays?
Yeah, I think it's just so funny because they have this world, that's what they call it, like the world. It's the world. And the world is so scary, and it's so dangerous, and it's so bad, but they can never tell you what the world is. The world is basically anything they don't approve of.
Right.
And the world has this incredible power, apparently. I wish people could see my face always, because I'm like, what is this world? But the world has this incredible power to influence us and change us. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that they know At a deep level, I don't think that they are all, some of them are, but not all of them are fully conscious that we are beings that are made for pleasure and that are made for beauty and that are made for enjoyment. And they strip all of that away from us out of this fear of this random hell that they invented too. And they strip all of that out of this fear that we will not be accepted by this deity that supposedly loves us. And since we are so stripped and moved away from our pleasure and our enjoyment and goodness, they know that it is that kind of, like giving into that will pull us always. So they are afraid of this world, but really what they are afraid of is themselves. What they are afraid of is to give into their own wants and desires, because desire is wrong, because wanting is wrong, because everything is just reduced to lust, lust for whatever, like your flesh is lusting all the time, instead of recognizing that perhaps you're just repressing your desires so much that you're all the time actually wanting more. And I've heard a lot of stories of people that they say the moment that I left evangelicalism and I was able to give myself to things, I didn't care for them anymore. Like people say, I got drunk maybe a couple of times, and then I was like, oh, that actually wasn't that enjoyable. I don't want to do that.
Yeah,
and they
lore of the forbidden fruit that people are curious about. Yeah,
right, because humans, we are incredibly we are just incredibly intuitive. Our bodies know, our brains know, we know. And the only reason that people end up with addictions, what we call addictions now, is because of coping mechanisms from trauma. It's not because we are naturally given to just overindulge and do too much. It's because we have so much trauma and we don't have enough effective support and effective tools to be able to deal with that trauma. So the only thing that we can do is cope through certain different addictions. But if we gave people support, if we gave people the different tools, if we were able to have different conversations about all of these things, then people would not give into addictions. Instead, they would have healthy and not maladaptive coping mechanisms. They would have either healthy mechanisms to cope, or they would be healed and they wouldn't need to be coping in certain, with whatever it is that life is. So I think that they have this fear all the time of the world, because desire and beauty and enjoyment of life pulls us. And in their own Bible, it says that if they just took the time to read Ecclesiastes, it would tell them to just enjoy life, but they don't. So they talk about this in these very obscure ways. They are not clear about what they are talking about. Because they don't even know what they are talking about. But if we allowed for people to say, like, yes, you are a sexual being. What does that mean? What does that look like? Give yourself into your sexuality. This is healthy. This is unhealthy. Go ahead and masturbate when you start wanting to masturbate. And, that's normal. This is what's not normal. This is what's normal. This is what's healthy. This is what's not healthy. Then people would be able to develop in a healthy way. And then sexuality, and then, any other thing that they call the world, like drinking or having relationships or any of those things, would not be so luring, because we would know what's healthy and what's not healthy, and we would be able to give into our own intuition and know that's not something that I want to do right now. That's going to end up harming me. But because we are not allowed that inside of this paradigm, we are like, well, I need to know if that's something that I want or I don't want. You are telling me I don't want it, but my brain is telling me that I do want it. And I'm pulled now in those both directions, denying myself, denying my own intuition all the time. So yeah, we see these women being themselves, expressing themselves sexually after, a couple millennia of being told women don't get to be sexual, like they don't. And we see these women being actively rebellious, this is a rebellion against the patriarchy and saying, I am who I am going to be, and I am a sexual being, and what are you going to do about it? And they do it in a creative way that is kind of, it's music, it's fun and whatever. And then they are up in arms thinking that we want to destroy society. No, this society has been destroyed. Do they think that it's good right now? Because women have been oppressed, women have been abused, women have been objectified. We cannot leave the house without thinking that we're going to get harassed. Do they think that we have a good society right now when they talk about we're going towards just absolute mayhem and it's going to be really bad? I'm like, do you think that it's been good?
We're at mayhem, and has nothing to do with these performances.
Right. And then you have Little Nas X, which is the same thing, saying, I am a gay man And what are you going to do about it? Because I am. And I'm going to embody everything that I am. And I am no longer going to continue to force myself into boxes for your comfort. No more. And they say, oh, you're trying to destroy society. I'm like, no, demanding that people fit into the boxes that you've created for them is destroying society. Yeah. It is causing complex trauma. And so we have everyone walking around with complex trauma and not even aware of that. And that causes for all of us to harm the other. That causes for all of us to live our lives trying to cope with that trauma in both unhealthy and healthy ways, but mostly in with maladaptive coping. So let's stop talking about the world and let's start talking about healthy behavior, because it's, you know, the world means nothing.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that whole position, because that's been around in various forms for a long time, you know, that kind of always, the world is always the antagonism. It's always the enemy. I think what Walter Brueggemann, I think, called it culture despising. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it's a double bind, really, because it's these people are destroying the world, and yet it's a world that actually most Christians don't want, or say they don't want, because or want the world that they can control. But it's a very interesting thing. I mean, I think for me, one of the big challenges in all of this is the presumption, well, two presumptions really. One, that all of your desire can be satisfied within the framework of a particular religious ideology, which assumes a kind of totality for human existence, which I think is a bit of an overreach, to say the least, particularly in our time. The other thing is that I also think that religion, as it manifests, particularly, I'll say modern Christianity, because I think it's more than evangelicalism. I think it's sort of spread out over everything. I think that the idea of conversion in modern Christianity is a narrowing of life, not an expanding of life, and it's a narrowing of desire. But really, what it is it's a displacement of desire. Yeah. You know, all of the desires that you have to be desires for God. So any desire that you have that isn't within the confines of the accepted religious practices is always false desire. When I think actually the opposite is true. I think religion is the false desire, and that's what has to be challenged by this whole thing. It's an interesting time, and I think what's really interesting is the provocations from this so-called world are becoming more and more adamant and strident and vocal as the presumed power, if you like, of Christianity is seen for what it is, which is basically the emperor's new clothes. There is no power to address the realities that are going on in society. And the only thing that people seem able to do actually is to demonize, which gives them a sort of inflated sense of their own importance and power. Because at the end of the day, it's a video. It's a very powerful video with a great statement, but the way it's taken so dramatically for all the wrong ways.
Yeah.
Like, it's one thing to take it seriously because you understand what's going on. It's another thing to take it seriously when you haven't got a clue what's really going on here, which is the contestation of a particular way of looking at life.
Yeah.
I think they do know what's going on, and that's what's the problem. But they don't. They have no idea. It's
the certainty notion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they think, oh, we know what's going on. This is the enemy.
Yeah.
Which is so funny to me, because they talk often about how the enemy has no power, but the enemy has a lot of power. But the enemy has no power, but it has a lot of power. You know, so they live inside of this cognitive dissonance all the time, talking about things in one way and then contradicting themselves, and then trying to figure out ways in which they can actually make those contradicting statements work all the time. And you said something about desire, how you know, they want us to desire things that we just really don't desire. And I remember being inside of the evangelical church and then telling me that you just have to want God so bad, and you have to want to be in relationship with this God. And I had to force that because I didn't necessarily want it, because I didn't even know what that meant. Because what does it mean to want this God? Now on this side, I'm like, it doesn't mean anything. It's manufactured. So they manufacture a desire that you're supposed to have, and then tell you to repress all the desire that you do have. And in doing that, you continue to be disembodied and away from yourself completely. And it's so harmful.
Yeah. And all you have to do is read a little Freud to know, firstly, we don't know what desire is really. And secondly, that religion is not the place to get it worked out. I mean, I was thinking while you were talking, you know, because trauma obviously has a lot of resonance in the therapeutic world, and it's a big thing, like in the world of, you know, psychoanalysis and Freud and stuff like that. And it's interesting that Freud sort of identified the two things that are important, I think. One, that life is very hard. And two, that we create mechanisms to deal with life. And, you know, he said that we use art, sexual love, intoxicants, and religion. Those are the ways that throughout history we've kind of handled life's difficulty. And he sort of makes room for all those things, but argues, and this is where his critique of religion comes, that it creates an illusion and you don't ever come back from the fantasy.
Right.
And, you know, things become problematic when you start to live in another world and not in this world.
Yeah.
You know, as though you have the option of
right.
being some, and I think, you know, I don't know, maybe that's just this obsession with the afterlife that still seems to fascinate much of contemporary Christianity.
Yeah, I think he's right. And I call that, you know, how I talk about how Christianity sells healing, but it just really gives you maladaptive coping. Sure. And instead of it's maladaptive coping that is acceptable, societally acceptable. Because if I tell you that I'm addicted to drugs, then you are very concerned for me. But if I tell you that I'm addicted to the church, you say that's not an addiction. It's just, you know, you are giving yourself to something good, like a higher power. It's like, no, it's just as maladaptive. If we are talking about not healing, but instead coping. And I've seen that happen time and time again. That's why the church prays, because really that it's predatory behavior.
Sure.
The church preys on people that have a lot of trauma, on poor people, on people that have been, you know, coping with drugs, on people that have a lot of trauma, because what they are doing is just switching their trauma. They are offering a more societally acceptable coping mechanism.
Sure.
And so that's what they do. And they are selling what you were saying. Exactly. They are selling an illusion, like your life is now healthy and good because you say Jesus all day long. But in reality, it is not healthy or good. And it's really not that much different than what they had before. It's just more acceptable.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the transference of impulses. Something. It's like, I always thought that thing, you know, you have to be 24/7 for Jesus. Like I always thought that thing was very dodgy, because if anybody was into anything else 24/7, you'd say they were some kind of addict of some sort. No one, because doing anything 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, however lovely, not good for you.
No.
It's very convenient for the church, for people to have an addiction to church, to God, to Jesus, to anything associated. It's very convenient for them. It works for them. So, and it keeps, you know, the people in power. I
just never worked out how to be full on for Jesus when you're asleep, but, you know, I guess that's why it never worked.
Your old men will dream dreams.
Oh, there you go. See, you're more biblical than me.
And then when you have a bad dream, you have to wake up and repent really quickly.
Exactly.
Because you're in charge of your unconscious as well.
You watch too much Cardi B or Little Nas X. I think that video is brilliant. I loved it. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Me too.
And I think it does exactly what art is supposed to do, which is be, prophetic and forthcoming and, reflect the state of culture.
Yeah.
So I thought it was just incredibly powerful, moving, artistic. I loved everything about it. But I think, Barry, I think I saw you chuckle when Jo mentioned it, and I had the same reaction when I first saw the video. I kind of laughed a little bit because I thought, oh, this is going to be a shitstorm now. Like,
you knew what that was. You knew what that was.
Culture wars of the church and Christianity and all the rest of it.
My problem's actually with the shoes. I just don't think they're very good.
There was a lot of conversation about the shoes too.
For shoes, if you don't get it right.
Yeah, you know what, they talk a lot about how the Bible is inspired by God because of that verse in Timothy. And if anything, like, to me, these kinds of things are inspired, by divinity, whatever you call it, by the one that is inside of these people. This is absolutely inspired work. Like, this is not something that just was pulled out of something. This was not something to try to get a reaction. This was not, yes, to try to get a reaction, but that was not the main reason. This was not something to just kind of make money, though I'm sure he will make a lot of money. But it was just, this was like a creative statement that takes us, like, it starts in Genesis and takes us all the way down to hell, where he like pole dances down to hell to kill the devil. Like, after giving him a lap dance. Like, this is thoughtful, and this is a very poignant critique of religion. And if there is anything of that if there is anything of that anywhere else, it would be in a lot of religious, like, not religious so much, but spiritual texts too, that you find, especially the ones that didn't make the canon, but even some that make the canon. Like, there is this poignant critique of, this is abusive and it's not okay, like just the book of Revelation alone.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, if anything is inspired by God, I think that Little Nas X is inspired by God. And I'll put my signature behind that statement.
Mine too.
You put your drop of blood behind that.
Yes.
I was just reading something, Palm Sunday, Holy Week, all the rest of it. And I'm kind of reading this piece of, Jesus kind of going triumphantly, well, not so triumphantly, but like in opposition to the triumph of Rome, and Pilate riding in on the other side of the city. And he's kind of, by contrast, riding in on this donkey and these palms. And, his whole procession was all about a peasant movement. He, in Mark's gospel especially, rarely goes into the city, goes into Jerusalem at this time, but stays in the rural outskirts area, because that's where the peasants were. That's where those who were being marginalized and taken most advantage of, the beggars, that's kind of where they all lived. And the authors of this particular text I was reading, they were just saying that Christianity, the way of Jesus, is a peasant religion. And when you find it coming to power, when you find it becoming too popular, it's probably turned into something that should be abandoned and perhaps subverted and started again. And so it got me thinking. I just thought, if I was in first century Palestine, would I be friends with Jesus? Would I want to be friends with Jesus? Would Jesus want to be friends with me? I don't know, like, if I saw someone being very anti-Rome and anti-imperial, I probably would stay away, because people get crucified who are anti-imperial, right? And so I was just kind of thinking, like, in light of your work, in light of what you're doing, in light of, does Christianity still have anything to say to the world today? It seems every generation, like we said in the beginning of this conversation, tries to reform it. The Twitter wars, the culture wars, if Jesus, were alive today, he'd be saying this, or Jesus said that, where everyone's on both sides, both liberal and conservative. People are giving their commentary and, their hermeneutic for interpreting Jesus's words. But part of me thinks, like, if Jesus were alive today, that this would still be a very fringe movement. It would be a very unpopular one. It'd be the kind of one that continues to get suppressed, that you get killed over, that you don't read in the papers about too much because it gets so squelched. What is your thought on the balancing act of being in the West, being in a place of privilege, trying to figure out what Christianity means and how to sort of follow in the imperatives of what we read in the New Testament. I know you've often talked about the idea of the Christ, and the Christ is what lives inside of us and is what is made manifest as we continue to pursue Christianity and community. I know you've talked about the empirical realities of being, and no, Jesus is not God, and no, it doesn't exist like this. And you've been very clear about that. But you've also said these theological understandings still have the power to heal and transform, and that's kind of what we're after.
Yeah.
So there was a bunch of questions in that, but what would be, just to kind of round up our conversation here, to kind of start to close it up, what would be your thoughts on some of that stuff as we try and make these fresh contributions?
Yeah, people talk about that. Franklin Graham just came out this weekend talking about, if Jesus were alive today, would he get a vaccine? Which,
oh God,
what kind of conversation are we having?
Oh
Like,
my God,
what kind
okay.
of, and Franklin Graham is getting a vaccine, and then all of these other evangelicals are like, no, Jesus wouldn't get the vaccine. I'm like, you guys are wasting time having conversations about whether a man in the first century would have a vaccine or not. Like, I don't even understand how stupid you sound. Like, do you not hear yourselves?
Yeah.
Because this is the reality. Jesus is not alive today.
Right.
So that question in itself is stupid. Like, if Napoleon were alive today, what would he do? Who cares? Napoleon's not alive today.
Yeah.
The more important conversation is, what would the Christ do? Which, I call it the Christ, but you can call it your authentic self. You can call it your true self, whatever, wherever you come from, like whatever tradition you want to, or whatever line of thought you want to align with. What would your true self do? What would the authentic self do? What would the Christ do? And the problem is that people cannot answer that question because they are not acquainted with it, because they continue to become, they are not their most authentic self, but the traumatized self. And so they can't answer that question. And especially evangelicals inside of the world thinking that they have to see everything through the lens of this Jesus. I mean, I can grab the very few words we have of Jesus, because we don't even have that much, and we don't even know if he said them. Like, the man didn't speak Greek, starting there, and all the words we have from him are in Greek. So I can take everything that he said and fit it and bend it and twist it into whatever I want it to be, which we can see through history, right? Because for some people, it's absolutely obvious that when you read about Jesus and when you read about this movement, he was standing with the marginalized. It's obvious. And then you have evangelicals for whom it's not obvious, for whom it's like, no, he was standing against the powers of, like, the evil powers that are cosmical, and you cannot even understand it. This is a spiritual reality, not a physical reality. And so, I think that the problem is that we continue to try to look through the lens of this man, because that's what Jesus was, a man, instead of realizing that today, right now, we have the power to make decisions on our own. We have the wisdom to make decisions on our own. But what we need to do is be able to differentiate between the traumatized self and the true self. What we need is to be able to know the difference between trauma making decisions for us, or our intuition really talking to us, be able to have enough emotional intelligence to not even that, but emotional fitness to be able to know, where is this coming from? Why am I feeling this way? What should I do? And what am I doing these things? Is it because I am trying to not deal with something? Is it because I have insecurities that I want to cover up? Or is it because, is this something that really I want to do? And nobody wants to do that because it's a lot easier. It's first is really hard work. And inside of capitalism, none of us have enough time to be able to stop to have those conversations. And second, it's really painful too. It's hard to be able to sit down with yourself and say, all the decisions I've made are because of trauma. There is the true self has not been unearthed inside of me, because I didn't even know what that meant. And it's convenient to have yourself be put into a box and say, all you have to do is do these 20 things, go to school, get married, have children, go to work every day. Like, it's easy. It's really lazy living. That's what it is. And lazy living for traumatized people is really easy, because you don't have to engage your brain. You just have to continue to follow the script that you were given. And awakened conscious, mindful living requires for you to think and to stop and to do things in ways that are not going to be necessarily acceptable or understood. It requires for you to be comfortable being misunderstood, and being comfortable being misunderstood requires for you to be comfortable with yourself, which most people are not. Most people are just, desperate to be accepted and to belong, which requires for them to do what people want them to do.
Yeah.
So when I talk about healing, and when I talk about the Christ, and when I talk about how spirituality really led me toward a path of healing, I talk about how the invitation of the Christ for me kept being, who are you? Me, not who's God or who's Jesus or who's none of that. Who is Jo? Who are you? And what does that mean at the deepest possible level? And what does that mean as far as the decisions that you want to make, the life that you want to lead, the kind of mother that you want to be, the kind of friend, the kind of spouse, the kind of, whatever, like, what does that mean for the way in which you're going to show up in the world? And that means that I spend a lot of time journaling and thinking and meditating. Really, is what I'm doing. Meditating and being aware and awakened. And even when I'm coping, I want to be coping aware. Like, I'm like, yep, I'm coping. I do not have right now the bandwidth or the tools to be able to deal with this, so I'm going to cope. And whatever. But coping aware is completely different than coping and pretending that that's healing.
Yeah,
they are different. So for me, the Christ continues to be this thing that pulls me, and people call it different things. There are, if you go through psychology, it's going to be different names, but we're talking about the same things, which is why, to me, the Bible and the Vedas and a lot of different spiritual conversations are brilliant, because these are ancient people that were tapping into the reality of having of healing and the self, what it means to be the self, what it means to be human. And these conversations are incredibly insightful, that they are having, between 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago, depending on what book we're talking about. And they are having these deep, insightful conversations about really, truly being. And now we are putting the science behind that. Like, we're looking at neuroscience, and we're looking at all of these different, like even the quantum field, and realizing, wow, these people were onto something, really. But as science is giving us better language for it, so we evolve too. And we don't keep talking about these things anymore, but we say, oh, what they were talking about really is our response to trauma that happens in the nervous system. And we get to have higher conversations. We get to elevate the conversation. But to me, all these conversations on trauma are spiritual conversations too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Barry, did you want to say something? You look like you were gonna.
No, I'm good. I mean, there's so much to say, but I know we probably need to wrap up. So
5-hour conversation, like a million-hour conversation. So just to, if I could, and if I get you wrong, tell me, but to sum up kind of what you just said, maybe perhaps the future and the hope of Christianity is living fully and deeply our own humanity and ourselves in the world.
Yes. And honestly, if the label Christian disappears, that's fine.
That's
like
fine.
We cannot hold on to these ridiculous labels so tightly. If it's going to be harmful for society, then it needs to go. But what cannot go is the principles that are not just behind Christianity, but behind a lot of different things. The principle of becoming yourself, like being and becoming. If divinity is I am, then let's be I am.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I love that. We're always talking about Christianity, but post theism, but post church, but post everything, post church, post belief, post, because it's not so, we make that distinction as opposed to in the atheist or in agnostic, because we're not outside of it, but we've moved through it, we're post it, and we have new understanding of what it means to be human now in light of what we've just kind of come through and what we find ourselves post. And with luck, hopefully we'll always be post something,
Yeah, so you're describing the evolving, right? We continue to evolve and we continue to move and towards, wholeness and healing and better, not just self, but better societies, better togetherness, because it matters. It's our life. Like, it's all we have. We don't know what happens after or before. So
precisely. I love that. Well, Jo, where can people find you and be involved in the work that you're doing? What are you up to? Where can people go to engage it?
Mostly like online. I do everything that I do online in most all social media platforms. I am there, and it's just my name. I do have a class coming up that I teach. It's called Christian Hegemony, and it's Christian supremacy, but I basically talk about Christian hegemony and the story between, the the religion of Christianity becoming the main religion of Rome all the way to today, and how Christianity has been used, co-opted, and appropriated by power to not only push its narrative, but to sell it as the reality of the world, basically. So I have that class with our Bible app. It's coming up. It's just a 5-week class, and we talk about ableism, and we talk about fat phobia and homophobia and the idea of marriage and whether it's even healthy for us or not, which is always a fun conversation to have because people freak out. And so, yeah, having children, parenting, all of the things, and how we've been conditioned to believe all of these things, but we get to question them all too. So yeah, I have that coming up. And then aside from that, I'm just like talking online all the time. So
yeah, you are. And we're here for it. We love it. We'll post all of that in the show notes so people can find you. Yeah, and we'll say goodbye. I'll end the recording now, and then we can say a proper goodbye, Jo, afterwards.
Sounds great.
All right. Thanks, everybody. And we will see you next week.